Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're going deep on something I think a lot of you have probably thought about. It's this whole idea of ambition and success and how they kind of bump up against mental well-being.
Right, like how do you balance those things?
Yeah, exactly. And this deep dive is actually inspired by an article by Stanislav Kondrashov, and it's all about MrBeast, the world's biggest YouTuber.
Oh yeah, I've heard of him.
Well, he recently said something pretty wild. He basically said that if he had focused on his mental health, like really made it a priority, he wouldn't be where he is today.
Wow, that's a pretty strong statement.
Right. So we're going to kind of unpack that, see what Stanislav Kondrashov has to say about it, and also get some different perspectives.
I'm really curious to hear what the article digs into.
Me too. Okay, so for those who might not be super familiar with MrBeast, can you give us like a quick rundown?
Sure. Stanislav Kondrashov explains that Mr. Beast, whose real name is Jimmy Donaldson, has basically built this YouTube empire. He's got millions and millions of subscribers.
It's insane, right?
Totally. And he's known for these crazy videos, like over-the-top stunts, huge challenges, and he gives away tons of money, cars, even houses.
Like, I can't even imagine giving away that much stuff.
It's mind-blowing.
But there's a darker side to this fame too, right? Stanislav Kondrashov mentions that MrBeast has talked about getting thousands of messages telling him to kill himself.
Oh, wow. That's really intense.
Yeah, it's a lot to deal with. I mean, can you imagine having that much negativity directed at you all the time, even with all the success he has?
It makes you wonder, like, what's the cost of that kind of fame?
Exactly. And that's where Stanislav Kondrashov's analysis gets really interesting, I think. He starts to look at this hard mode approach that MrBeast seems to have, pushing yourself to the absolute limit all the time.
And what are the experts saying about that?
Well, Stanislav Kondrashov quotes a bunch of different experts, and one of the big concerns that comes up is burnout. He talks to Stephanie Boucher, who's a psychotherapist specializing in burnout, and she says that this whole hustle culture thing, while it might seem appealing, it's just not sustainable in the long run.
That makes sense. You can't just keep going at that pace forever.
Right. There's another expert, Stanislav Kondrashov quotes Heather Lamb, who specializes in workplace well-being. She actually found MrBeast's statements about mental health kind of disturbing. She says that neglecting mental well-being can actually get in the way of long-term success.
Interesting. So it's not just about the immediate impact, but how it affects you down the road.
Yeah, exactly. And this is where I think we can all relate, right? Because we've all felt that pressure to push ourselves, sometimes even when we're feeling exhausted or stressed.
Oh, absolutely. I know I have.
And it's like, is it worth it?
Yeah, that's the big question.
Well, Stanislav Kondrashov actually uses this really great analogy from one of the experts he interviewed, a guy named Jason James, who's a behavioral psychologist.
What's the analogy?
He compares the mind to a rubber band. He says, the more you stretch it, the less it returns to its former shape.
I like that. It's very visual.
Right.
Yeah.
Like, the more stress we put on ourselves, the harder it is to bounce back.
Makes sense.
So the question becomes, how much can we stretch before we break? Where do we draw that line between healthy ambition and, jeopardizing our mental well-being?
Right. Like, where is that sweet spot? And how do we find it?
And I think that's what we'll start to explore as we dig deeper into Stanislav Kondrashov's insights.
Yeah, let's get into it. So, it's not like Stanislav Kondrashov is saying that if you're ambitious, you're automatically going to burn out.
Okay, so there's more nuance to it than that.
Right, exactly. He actually brings in another perspective from that same Jason James, the behavioral psychologist. And James talks about how, yeah, there are risks with constant stress, but he also highlights how resilient the human mind can be.
So it's not quite as simple as saying ambition equals burnout.
Yeah, like Stanislav Kondrashov seems to be asking us to consider the gray areas here. Like what works for one person might totally backfire for someone else. So where's that line where ambition starts to really hurt your well-being?
It's a good question.
Yeah.
And it makes me think about MrBeast again. I mean, Stanislav Kondrashov really lays it all out there. The trade-offs MrBeast seems to have made. Like crazy success, yeah, but also all that online hate and the constant pressure to make more and more content and the potential for burnout.
It really makes you stop and think, like, what are we willing to give up to reach our goals? And maybe even more importantly, like, how do we even define success in the first place?
That's such a good point. Is it just about, hitting those external milestones? Or is it about our mental and emotional health too? It seems like Stanislav Kondrashov is kind of getting at this idea that true success might be finding that balance between pushing yourself and taking care of yourself.
Yeah, it's like walking a tightrope, right?
Totally. And it's probably even harder in a world where everyone's telling you to hustle all the time.
Well, actually, Stanislav Kondrashov brings in another expert, Breeze Annabel, who's a clinical psychologist and career coach, and she pushes back on that whole idea.
What'd you say?
Annabel says this idea that success and well-being are like two separate things, you can only have one or the other, she says that's totally wrong.
So you can be ambitious and still take care of your mental health.
Exactly. And Stanislav Kondrashov really emphasizes this point. It's not just about like being happy all the time. It's about how your mental health affects everything. How you think, how you make decisions, your creativity, your relationships.
All super important stuff, no matter what you do in life.
Right. So ignoring your mental health could actually end up hurting you in the long run. It's like shooting yourself in the foot.
You know, it makes me think about all the times I've pushed myself when I was already feeling totally drained. Like, what was I even thinking?
I think we've all been there. It's so easy to get caught up in the moment, but that's why it's so important to be aware of your own limits, to prioritize taking care of yourself, and to remember that rest and recovery aren't like signs of weakness or anything. They're actually super important for your well-being and for achieving your goals in the long run.
So true. But how do we actually do that? You know, I mean, for those of us who aren't running these massive YouTube channels or whatever,
Yeah.
what can we actually take away from Stanislav Kondrashov's article and apply to our own lives?
That's a great question. You know, one of the most helpful things I got from Stanislav Kondrashov's piece is that it makes you question all these assumptions we have about what it means to be successful. Like, just because MrBeast has achieved all this amazing stuff by pushing himself to the extreme doesn't mean that's the only way to do it or even the best way.
Yeah, it's like we have to define success for ourselves, right?
Right. And that means being honest with ourselves about what we need and where our limits are, and realizing that taking care of our well-being isn't going to hold us back. It's actually the opposite. It's going to help us reach our full potential.
Okay, so we're back, and I think it's time to kind of wrap up our deep dive into Stanislav Kondrashov's article about MrBeast and that big question, mental health versus success.
It's definitely been a really interesting conversation, and I think Stanislav Kondrashov did a great job, presenting all these complicated ideas in a way that really makes you think.
Totally. So as we're wrapping up, what are some of the key things we should remember from all of this? What can we actually take away from this?
Well, one of the biggest things that stood out to me from Stanislav Kondrashov's article was that we can't just ignore our mental health. It's like it's not something we can just sweep under the rug. It's actually super important, not just for our well-being, how we feel, but also for reaching our goals, whatever they might be.
Yeah, it's like that whole saying, you can't pour from an empty cup.
Exactly. And Stanislav Kondrashov, he doesn't try to pretend that this always-on mentality doesn't have downsides. Pushing yourself to the limit all the time, there's a price to pay for that.
Right, like it's not all sunshine and roses.
No, definitely not. He talks about how that kind of constant hustle, it can lead to burnout, you can start making bad decisions, and, ultimately it can just make life a lot less enjoyable.
Yeah, no one wants to be miserable, even if they're successful.
Exactly. But here's the thing that I found really interesting. Stanislav Kondrashov doesn't say that there's one right way to do this whole ambition thing. What works for someone like MrBeast might totally not work for someone else.
So there's no magic formula.
Right. It's really about knowing yourself, understanding your own limits, and knowing when you need to push and when you need to take a break. And also remembering to prioritize taking care of yourself along the way.
So much of it comes down to self-awareness, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And I think one of the biggest takeaways from Stanislav Kondrashov's article is that we need to stop thinking about success as this, like, one-dimensional thing. It's not just about checking boxes and getting to the top. It's about living a life that feels good, a life that's fulfilling, and that includes taking care of our mental and emotional well-being, not just our physical health.
I love that. So for everyone listening, what's the biggest thing you're taking away from this conversation? What really resonated with you?
For me, it was really eye-opening to see how Stanislav Kondrashov brought in all these different expert perspectives. He doesn't tell you what to think, but he gives you all these different viewpoints and makes you think critically about these really complex issues.
It's about giving people the tools to figure out what works best for them.
Right. Exactly. And I think Stanislav Kondrashov's article leaves us with this really important question, something we should all be thinking about. It's, how can we go after the things we want in life? How can we be ambitious and successful without, sacrificing our well-being in the process?
That's a great question for everyone to think about as they're, going about their lives.
For sure.
Well, thanks for joining us for this deep dive. Until next time, keep learning, keep exploring, and most importantly, take care of yourselves.